Something wasn't right with my sister, and I could feel it in my bones. You know that gut feeling when you just know something's off about someone you've known your whole life? That's exactly what I was experiencing. It all started on a regular Sunday morning. The autumn breeze was gentle, leaves were starting to turn golden, and everything seemed perfectly normal until it wasn't. My sister and I had grown up going to the same church, sitting in the same pews, singing the same hymns. But that Sunday, something changed. I remember watching her walk out of the confession booth. Her face was pale, almost like she'd seen a ghost. Her hands were trembling as she clutched her small prayer book. At first, I thought maybe she was just emotional from the confession. It happens sometimes, right? But no, this was different. My sister had always been the life of our family. The one who'd crack jokes during serious moments, the one who'd dance while doing the dishes, the one who'd make funny faces behind Mom's back during her lectures. She was sunshine personified. But after that Sunday, it was like someone had dimmed her light. The changes were supple at first. She stopped humming while getting ready for work. Her phone calls became shorter, her laughter less frequent. When we'd have our weekly sister movie nights, she'd zone out, staring at nothing in particular. The bags under her eyes grew darker with each passing day. "It's just work stress," our mum would say, patting her hand during family dinner. The hospital can be overwhelming for new nurses. But I knew my sister, she thrived under pressure. She'd handled 12-hour shifts before without losing her spark. The most telling sign was how she reacted to church. My sister, who used to wake up early every Sunday to get the best parking spot, now made excuses to skip services. "I'm not feeling well," she'd say. "I have an early shift. I need to catch up on sleep," each excuse more transparent than the last. But what really sent chills down my spine was her reaction when anyone mentioned the new pastor. Her fork would freeze midway to her mouth, her shoulders would tense, and she'd find some reason to leave the room. It wasn't just discomfort, it was fear. I tried asking her about it once, during our weekly grocery shopping trip. "Hey, is everything okay? You seem different lately." She just gave me that fake smile she'd been wearing since that Sunday. "Everything's fine," she said, suddenly very interested in comparing cereal brands. "Just tired, that's all." But nothing was fine. My sister, who used to share everything with me, from her first crush to her biggest fears, was now building walls. The same person who once called me at 3 a.m. to tell me about a cute dog she saw was now keeping secrets. The final straw came during our mom's birthday dinner. Someone mentioned the upcoming church fundraiser, and my sister knocked over her water glass. As everyone rushed to clean up the mess, I saw it, that look of pure panic in her eyes when the pastor's name came up in conversation. That's when I knew something had happened in that confession booth, something that had transformed my vibrant, loving sister into a shadow of herself. And I was determined to find out what it was, no matter what it took. Little did I know, pulling on this thread would unravel something far bigger and more sinister than I could have ever imagined. Sometimes, the scariest monsters aren't the ones hiding under your bed. They're the ones hiding behind respectability and trust. I've always been told I have a detective's mind. Mom used to joke that I could find anything she misplaced, just by thinking about where she might have been that day. But now, that same instinct was telling me to dig deeper into what was happening with my sister. The investigation started small. I noticed my sister's car in the church parking lot on Wednesday evenings, long after the youth group meetings had ended. At first, I thought maybe she'd joined a prayer circle or Bible study group, something to help her through whatever was troubling her. But when I casually asked about it over breakfast, she nearly choked on her coffee. "Oh, that? Just spiritual guidance sessions," she mumbled, suddenly very interested in stirring her already dissolved sugar. The new pastor thinks it's important for young members to have individual mentoring. That's when the first red flag went up. My sister had never needed spiritual guidance before. She was always the one giving advice to others, helping them through their troubles. Now she was spending hours alone at church. Something didn't add up. I started paying more attention to church services, but not to the sermons. Instead, I watched the congregation, especially the younger women. That's when I noticed the pattern. They all had this strange way of avoiding eye contact with the pastor, like they were afraid to be noticed. One girl, barely out of high school, practically ran from the building when services ended. The pastor was different too, now that I really looked. He had this way of seeming both warm and cold at the same time. Like a TV preacher, all perfect smiles and practiced gestures. He'd been at our church for 6 months, but somehow I'd never noticed how his eyes didn't match his smile. During coffee hour after service, I'd catch bits and pieces of conversations. Such a blessing to happen here, the older members would say. But the younger ones, they'd just nod and find reasons to be somewhere else. It was like watching 2 different churches existing in the same space. One day, I decided to stay late after the afternoon service, parking my car where I could see the church entrance. My sister's guidance session was scheduled for that evening. As I waited, I noticed something odd. The lights in the confession booth stayed on long after the main church lights were dimmed. Through the stained glass windows, I could see shadows moving. The session lasted 2 hours. 2 hours in a confession booth. That's not normal, right? When my sister finally came out, she looked exhausted, clutching her purse like it was a shield. I started taking notes on my phone. Dates, times, how long these sessions lasted. I noticed other young women going in for similar guidance. Some came out looking worried, others looking relieved, like they'd just handed over a heavy burden. But none of them looked at peace, like you'd expect after spiritual counseling. The turning point came when I overheard 2 church volunteers whispering in the kitchen during a potluck dinner. "Did you notice the new equipment in the confession booth?" one asked. "The pastor said it's for recording sermons, but why put it there instead of near the pulpit?" Recording equipment? In a confession booth? Every alarm bell in my head started ringing. Confessions are supposed to be private, sacred even. What kind of pastor records them? But the real shock came when I tried to look up information about our new pastor online. His background, his previous churches, anything. What I found, or rather what I didn't find, made my blood run cold. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere 6 months ago. That night, I lay awake in bed, thinking about my sister, about how she used to be versus who she was now, about all the other young women at church, their nervous glances and hurried exits, about recording equipment where it shouldn't be, and a pastor with no past. I knew I had to do something, but how do you fight something you can't even name? How do you protect someone who won't tell you what they need protection from? Little did I know, I was about to find out exactly what we were up against, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. They say truth comes out in unexpected moments. For us, it happened on a rainy Tuesday night, over a bottle of Mom's favorite wine that I'd been saving for a special occasion. My sister had texted me earlier, asking if she could come over. Just the way she wrote, "Can we talk?" No emojis, no exclamation marks. I knew something was different this time. I'd ordered her favorite pizza and made sure the apartment was cozy. When she showed up at my door, soaking wet despite having an umbrella, I could tell she'd been crying. Not the loud, dramatic kind of crying, but the quiet kind that leaves your eyes looking tired and your soul feeling heavy. "I can't sleep anymore," she said, collapsing onto my couch. "Every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking about what happened in that confession booth." Her hands were shaking as she reached for the wine glass I offered her. For a moment, we just sat there, listening to the rain hitting the windows. My sister took a long sip of wine, then another, like she was gathering courage from each drop. "You know those confession recordings I told you were for spiritual guidance?" she finally said. "They're not. They're for something else entirely." The truth spilled out like a dam breaking. The pastor hadn't been recording confessions for spiritual purposes. He'd been gathering information. Private, personal information about everyone in the congregation, but especially about the young women who came for guidance. "He knows everything about everyone," my sister whispered, her voice trembling. "Who's having marriage problems, who's struggling with money, who's hiding secrets from their families. And he uses it. He uses it to control people." She told me about how it started small. How after her first recorded confession, he'd casually mentioned details about her workplace, things she'd never told him directly. How he'd talk about other church members' private struggles during their guidance sessions, making it clear he knew everything about everyone. "But that's not even the worst part," she continued, now pacing my living room. "Last week, I overheard him on the phone in his office. He was talking about valuable data points and potential targets, like we're not even people to him, just information to be used." My sister described how the pastor had started suggesting certain church members invest in special ministry opportunities, how he knew exactly who had money troubles and who had savings to spare, how he could quote from confessions made months ago, word for word. "Remember Mrs. Chen from the choir?" my sister asked. She donated her entire retirement savings to the church's building fund after a private meeting with him. The next Sunday, he announced the money would be used for technological upgrades. The pieces were falling into place. The recording equipment, the long guidance sessions, the pastor's mysterious background. It wasn't just about gathering information, it was about power and control. "There's more," my sister said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I'm not the only one who knows. There are others, other women from church who've noticed things. We've been talking, comparing notes. Some of them have stories that are worse than mine." She pulled out her phone and showed me a group chat. Messages from other young women from our church sharing similar experiences. Different details, same pattern. The pastor using their confessions, their private moments of vulnerability, as weapons against them. "We're afraid to stop going to the guidance sessions," she admitted. "He knows too much about all of us now. About our families, our jobs, our mistakes." One girl tried to skip a session last month, and suddenly her parents knew about things she'd only ever mentioned in confession. The rain had stopped outside, but I barely noticed. My mind was racing, trying to process everything. This wasn't just about my sister anymore. This wasn't even just about our church. This was something bigger, something darker. "I needed you to know," my sister said, finally sitting back down, "because I don't know what to do next. He has all these recordings, all this information, and he's not working alone, I'm sure of it. Sometimes he gets calls from other pastors talking about the program and expanding operations." Looking at my sister in that moment, I saw both her strength and her fear. She'd carried this burden for so long, trying to protect herself and others. Now that I knew the truth, there was no going back. But the real question was, what were we going to do about it? Little did we know, exposing the truth would put us both in more danger than we could have imagined. Once you start pulling at a loose thread, sometimes the whole sweater unravels. That's exactly what happened after my sister's confession. What started as concern for her turned into something much bigger. A web of secrets that spread far beyond our little church. I couldn't sleep that night after she left. My mind kept racing, thinking about all those recordings, all those secrets. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Instead of heading to the office, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, a notebook, and the largest cup of coffee I could make. First, I started with our pastor. Looking deeper into his background, I found something odd. His credentials seemed perfect, too perfect, like someone had carefully crafted them. But when I tried to contact the seminary he supposedly graduated from, they had no record of him. The previous churches he claimed to work at, either they didn't exist or they had mysteriously closed down. Then I remembered something my sister mentioned, those phone calls about the program and expanding operations. I started searching for patterns. Other churches in nearby states that had suddenly changed leadership in the past few years. Places where beloved old pastors had been replaced by new ones with spotless credentials and charismatic smiles. The pattern was there, hidden but clear once you knew what to look for. Churches that suddenly got technology upgrades. Congregations that started focusing heavily on private confessions and guidance sessions. Young women who stopped attending services. Elderly members who mysteriously donated large sums of money. I created a map on my wall, connecting the dots with red string like in those detective movies. Each string led to another church, another pastor, another story that didn't quite add up. But the real breakthrough came from an unexpected source. My sister's group chat had grown. More women were joining, sharing their experiences. One of them worked at a local bank. She noticed something strange. Large transfers from church accounts to offshore accounts, always just under the amount that would trigger automatic reporting. Another woman, who volunteered in the church office, mentioned seeing strange invoices. Equipment purchases that didn't match what was actually delivered. Construction work that never happened. It was like the church had become a giant washing machine, but for money, not clothes. The deeper I dug, the more worried I became. This wasn't just about recording confessions anymore. These people were using churches as fronts for something much bigger. They targeted smaller communities, places where faith and trust ran deep. They looked for congregations with wealthy elderly members, vulnerable young people, and strong community ties. Their method was always the same: get in, gain trust, gather secrets, then use those secrets to control people and extract money. The confessions weren't just for blackmail, they were for identifying targets. Who had money? Who had influence? Who could be pressured into silence? One afternoon, while I was adding another red string to my wall, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. Just 4 words. Stop looking. Final warning. My hands started shaking, but not from fear, from anger. They were watching me now too. I started being more careful, used different coffee shops for my research, bought a new laptop, started encrypting everything. But I couldn't stop, not now. Not when I was starting to see how big this really was. The most chilling discovery came when I found the connection between all these churches. They were all bought or taken over by the same religious organization, one that didn't exist 5 years ago. On paper, it looked like a normal religious non-profit, but its board members were all ghost names, its address led to an empty office building, and its financial records were locked behind layers of legal protection. My sister was right. Our pastor wasn't working alone. He was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. A network of fraudulent religious leaders using people's faith and trust against them, using confession booths as intelligence-gathering tools, using religious donations to hide money laundering operations. But they had made one big mistake. They thought people would be too ashamed, too afraid to speak up. They didn't count on the strength of women supporting each other. They didn't expect someone to start connecting the dots. As I stared at my wall of evidence that night, I realized we had reached a turning point. We couldn't just walk away now, we knew too much. But going forward meant facing something powerful and dangerous, something that wouldn't hesitate to use our deepest secrets against us. The question wasn't whether to act anymore, but how to do it without putting everyone in danger. Because now we weren't just fighting for my sister, we were fighting for every person who'd ever trusted their pastor with their deepest confessions, only to have that trust betrayed. Sometimes the scariest moments in life come right after you've made up your mind to be brave. That Sunday morning, as I walked into church clutching a folder of evidence under my arm, my legs felt like jelly, but there was no turning back now. The service went on as usual, hymns, prayers, the pastor's perfectly practiced smile. I sat in my usual spot, watching him deliver his sermon about truth and redemption. The irony wasn't lost on me. Every few minutes, my hand would brush against the folder hidden in my bag, reminding me why I was there. I'd spent the whole week preparing for this moment. The group of women from my sister's chat had helped gather more evidence. Bank statements showing suspicious transfers, screenshots of threatening messages, recordings of phone conversations captured by one brave church secretary who'd gotten suspicious of the late-night calls. The plan was simple: confront the pastor after the service, when most people had left but enough would still be around to witness whatever happened. My sister would be waiting in her car outside, ready to call for help if needed. 3 other women from the group would be scattered around the church, pretending to tidy up after the service. As the last hymn ended and people started filing out, my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I waited until the pastor finished his usual doorway goodbyes, watching as he headed back inside, probably heading to his office like he always did after service. "Pastor," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to talk." He turned around, that practiced smile still in place. "Of course, my child. Shall we schedule a guidance session?" "No," I said, pulling out the folder. "We need to talk about these recordings. About the money. About everything." His smile flickered for just a second, but that was enough. I saw what was behind it, something cold and calculating. "I'm not sure what you mean," he said, but his eyes had locked onto the folder in my hands. "I think you do," I replied, opening the folder. "Let's start with these bank transfers, or maybe the fake credentials. Or should we discuss how you're connected to 12 other churches doing the exact same thing?" The change in his demeanor was like watching ice crack. That warm, fatherly mask just slipped. What was underneath made my skin crawl. But I kept talking, laying out document after document on a nearby table. "You know what's interesting about digital recordings? I asked, pulling out more papers. They leave traces, metadata, timestamps. And when you store them on church computers, well, let's just say your 8 security could use some work. That's when he laughed. Not a warm chuckle, but something that made the air feel colder. You have no idea what you're dealing with, do you? He said, leaning forward. This isn't just about your little church. This is bigger than you can imagine. I know exactly what this is, I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. Money laundering, blackmail, exploitation, and it stops now. He straightened up, smoothing his tie. You really think you can stop this? We have recordings of every confession made in this church for the past 6 months. Every secret, every shame, every sin. How many lives would be ruined if those went public? That's your mistake, I said, pulling out my phone. Thinking people's shame is stronger than their courage. I pressed play, and his own voice filled the room. A conversation with someone about target demographics and profitable congregations. His face changed again, and for a moment I saw real fear. But then he smiled, and somehow that was worse. This church, he said, gesturing around us. It's not even real. None of this is. It's all a front. And there are people much more powerful than me who want to keep it that way. Then they shouldn't have messed with my sister, I said, my voice finally shaking, or any of the other women you've terrorized. He reached for the folder, but I pulled it back. You have no idea what you're starting, he warned. The people behind this, they'll destroy you. Maybe, I admitted, but right now, I'm going to destroy you. That's when my sister burst through the door, followed by 2 police officers. The pastor's face went completely blank as one of the officers started reading him his rights. But as they led him away, he looked back at me with a smile that made my blood run cold. You think this is over? He called out. This is just the beginning. Standing there in the empty church, watching him being driven away, I had a terrible feeling he was right. We hadn't just exposed one corrupt pastor, we'd tugged at the first thread of something much bigger and much darker. And somewhere out there, powerful people were already planning their revenge. They say the calm before the storm is the most dangerous part. You know something's coming, but you don't know when or how bad it'll be. That's exactly how it felt in the days after we got the pastor arrested. At first, we thought we'd won. The local news ran stories about religious leader arrested on multiple charges. My sister's group chat was full of relief messages and celebration emojis. For exactly 3 days, we felt like heroes. Then the strange things started happening. It began with my sister's laptop disappearing from her desk at the hospital during her shift. Nothing else was taken, just the laptop. The same day, my apartment door was unlocked when I got home. Nothing was missing, but my investigation wall had been completely cleared. All my notes, all my evidence, gone. The women from the group chat started reporting similar incidents. One found her car trunk open, all her documents missing. Another's home office had been searched while she was grocery shopping. They weren't just stealing evidence, they were sending a message. We know where you are. We know how to get to you. The threatening notes started appearing everywhere. Under my windshield wipers, slipped into my mailbox, even tucked into my grocery bags. Always typed, never handwritten. Always the same message, time is running out. My sister was the first to notice we were being followed. Don't look now, she whispered during one of our coffee meetups, but that silver car has been behind me all morning. We started taking different routes to work, switching up our routines, meeting in different places each time. The police weren't much help. Without concrete evidence of a threat, they'd say, letting the sentence trail off. But we knew the threats were real. The pastor's words kept echoing in my head. This is bigger than you can imagine. One night, my sister called me in tears. Her patient records at the hospital had been accessed, all her shifts had been changed, her credentials temporarily suspended. Someone was trying to mess with her job, her life. They were using the system against us. That's when we got the first message from another survivor. A woman from a church 3 states away reached out through a secure email. The same thing happened at our church, she wrote. We tried to expose them. They destroyed our lives. But we found others who helped us disappear. More messages followed. A network of survivors emerged, people who'd faced what we were facing, who'd found ways to fight back. They taught us how to secure our phones, how to spot surveillance, how to communicate safely. We learned to use cash only, to meet in crowded places, to watch for cars that appeared too often, to keep go bags packed and ready. My sister and I started sleeping at different places each night, never staying anywhere too long. The hardest part was not being able to trust anyone. When our mom called, worried about why we'd missed Sunday dinner, we couldn't tell her the truth. When my sister's coworkers asked about her strange schedule changes, she had to make up excuses. We were living in a bubble of paranoia, jumping at every shadow. But we weren't just running, we were gathering strength. Other women from different churches were still sending us evidence, bank records, audio files, photos of documents, each piece adding to the bigger picture of just how vast this network was. One of the survivors who reached out had been hiding for 2 years. She'd been a bookkeeper at her church before she discovered the truth. They're not just using churches, she told us in a heavily encrypted message. They're using charities, schools, anywhere people trust with their secrets and their money. The network of survivors grew larger every day. Women who'd been silenced, who'd been forced to move, to change their names, to abandon their lives, all because they'd discovered the same truth we had. But instead of breaking them, it had made them stronger. We started using secure messaging apps, building our own support system. Safe houses were offered, jobs in new cities arranged. People who'd rebuilt their lives were helping others do the same. Looking back, maybe the pastor was right. This was just the beginning, but not in the way he meant. This wasn't just about exposing one corrupt church anymore. This was about something much more powerful, survivors coming together, protecting each other, fighting back. We weren't just running anymore. We were building something. A network of truth-tellers and protectors. Every person who joined us made us stronger. Every piece of evidence they brought got us closer to exposing the whole thing. But we had no idea that the biggest revelation was still to come, and it would come from the last person we ever expected to help us. The truth has a funny way of coming out, even when it's buried under years of lies. For us, that moment came on a quiet Sunday evening, exactly 1 month after we'd gone into hiding. I was staying at a safe house 2 towns over, trying to piece together new evidence when my phone buzzed. A message from my sister. Dad wants to meet, says it's important, says he knows everything. My first instinct was to say no. We'd been careful about family contact, knowing they could be used against us. But something about the message felt different. Maybe it was because our dad had been acting strange lately, missing church for the first time in decades, making excuses about business trips. We agreed to meet at an old diner just off the highway. The kind of place where truckers stop for coffee at 3 a.m., where nobody pays attention to anyone else. My sister and I arrived early, checking every exit, every face, just like we'd learned to do. When our dad walked in, he looked older somehow, tired in a way I'd never seen before. He sat down across from us, hands folded on the table, and said 7 words that changed everything. I'm the reason he came to our church. The story poured out of him like he'd been holding it back for years. How he'd gotten involved in some questionable investments back when we were kids. How he'd lost money, church money, trying to fix his mistakes. How they'd found out and used it to control him. They approached me at a church conference, he explained, his coffee getting cold in front of him. Said they could make the problem go away. All I had to do was help bring in their new pastor. Vote the right way on the church board. Look the other way when things didn't add up. His hands were shaking as he pulled out a thick envelope. Inside were documents going back 15 years. Bank transfers, meeting notes, names of other church elders in the same situation. A whole network of blackmail and manipulation. I thought I was protecting our family, he said, his voice breaking. But when I saw what they were doing to you girls, I couldn't stay quiet anymore, even if it means I go down with them. The documents he brought were like missing puzzle pieces. They showed how the organization targeted churches through their own leadership, how they used financial pressure to replace honest pastors with their own people, how they built their network using the shame and fear of good people who'd made mistakes. But our dad had done something they hadn't expected. He kept records, copies of everything, names, dates, account numbers, a paper trail leading all the way to the top of the organization. There's more, he said, pulling out his phone. I've been recording their calls for months. ever since I realized what they were doing to the young women in our church. I couldn't let them hurt my daughters. That night, hunched over a sticky dinner table, we formulated a plan, not just to expose one church or one pastor, but to bring down the entire network. Our dad's evidence, combined with what we'd gathered from other survivors, was enough to launch a federal investigation. The next few weeks were a blur. FBI agents, witness statements, more victims coming forward, churches across the country being investigated. The whole house of cards started falling. The morning they arrested the organization's leaders, I watched it on TV from a hotel room. Wealthy men in expensive suits being led away in handcuffs, bank accounts frozen, assets seized. The headlines called it the largest case of religious-based fraud in state history. But the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet strength of survivors finding their voices, in the courage of people like my dad choosing truth over shame, in the way communities came together to rebuild their churches, this time on foundations of real faith and transparency. My sister went back to nursing, but now she also runs support groups for survivors of religious manipulation. The women from the group chat became lifelong friends, a network of support that spans the country. And our dad? He faced consequences for his part in it all, but his cooperation helped bring down something much bigger than himself. He's working now to help other church leaders spot and prevent similar schemes. As for me, I learned something important through all of this. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness isn't exposure, it's connection. The way people come together to protect each other. The way truth, once spoken, spreads like light. The pastor was right about one thing. It was just the beginning. But not of what he thought. It was the beginning of healing, of change, of people reclaiming their faith from those who tried to use it as a weapon. Sometimes the most shocking ending isn't in what gets destroyed, but in what gets rebuilt from the ashes.